Nobody warned me the fourth one had screamed, told me about the burns. They told me the construct had discharged some kind of localized field, non-lethal, supposedly, though the third surveyor had needed 3 weeks in a pressure cot before she could hold a stylus again. They handed me the incident log like a standard equipment brief, and they watched my face the way people watch a face, when they already know the answer. I didn't ask about the screaming until later. By then I'd already met it. My name is Marin Solis. I am 61 years old. I have cataloged relics on 11 excavation platforms across 6 systems, and before that I swept the floors of the archive hall at Kesset Station for 9 years, while I studied the structural grammar of pre-expansion, contact artifacts in whatever hours the station left me. I am not a surveyor. I am not an engineer. My title on the Vareth platform manifest was Tomb Keeper, Grade 3, which is the polite language organizations use when they want someone experienced enough to not break anything, but not senior enough to argue about the pay. I was the 5th person they sent. The construct had been in Shaft 11 for 230 years. That was how long the platform had been operational. 230 years of excavation, of teams rotating through, of specialists and commanders and linguists, and once a delegation of 3 ambassadors, who had flown in from the central reaches specifically to touch it. It had refused every one of them. Not violently, not at first. It simply sat in the dark of the shaft, sealed tight along its seams, and did nothing. When people pushed, when they laid hands on it with instruments, when the surveyors of the 3rd cycle had tried a full cutting rig, it pushed back. The field, the discharge, the burns. After the 4th incident, they sealed off Shaft 11 and left it for 16 years. Then funding changed hands and ambition reset itself, the way it always does, and they sent me. I remember the descent. The lift was old and slow and smelled of machine oil and the mineral damp that deep excavation shafts collect over decades. My assistant, a young man named Orvid, 23, earnest, frightened, stood beside me holding a sensor array and not speaking. I appreciated that. The shaft opened at the bottom into a chamber that had been cut from the rock by whoever built the platform, not the original excavators, someone older. The walls were dressed stone, fitted without mortar in that way that pre-expansion builders sometimes achieved, each block matched to its neighbor, with a tolerance that modern fabricators still struggle to replicate. The ceiling was low at the entrance, and then vaulted upward as you walked in, so that, by the time you reached the center of the chamber, you were standing in a space that felt almost like the interior of a temple. The construct was in the center. It was cylindrical, roughly 2 meters in diameter, perhaps 3.5 meters tall, though it was difficult to be certain because its base had sunk slightly into the stone floor, as if the weight of it, or the age of it, had pressed it gradually downward over however many centuries it had sat here before the platform was built. Above it, the surface was dark, not the flat dark of paint or lacquer, but the deep absolute dark of a material that absorbed light rather than flecting it. You looked at it, and your eyes found no purchase. The seams ran in rings around its circumference at intervals of roughly 30 centimeters, and between the seams, if you looked closely, you could see the faintest impression of markings. Not carved, not etched, present somehow, the way grain is present in old wood. I stood at the edge of the chamber for a long time. He asked me if I wanted the sensor array active. I told him to leave it off. He asked why. I told him I wasn't sure, but that in my experience the things people reach for first, to measure and read and quantify, are usually the things that make an old sealed object feel like a problem to be solved. And some objects, in my experience, are not problems. He didn't understand that. He was 23. I walked to the construct alone. I stopped about a meter from it and stood there in the quiet of the chamber. The light from our portable units caught the curve of its surface without illuminating it. It remained dark regardless, a darkness that felt occupying rather than empty. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the faint mechanical hum of the platform far above us, filtered down through 200 meters of rock and steel and time. I do not know exactly what made me speak. I have thought about it since. The truest answer I can give is that it felt rude not to. I have spent 30 years around old things, and there is a quality that some of them carry. A weight of waiting that is not passive, not inert, not the waiting of a rock or a dead mechanism, but the waiting of something that has been patient in a way that requires intention. This object had that quality. It had been waiting. Anyone who stood in that chamber for more than a minute would have felt it. So I spoke to it the way I speak to old machines when I am working alone, quietly. Without expectation, I said, "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to understand what you are. If that's not possible, I can sit with that." The silence afterward was the same silence as before. Orvid's sensor array made no sound. The platform hum continued in its distant register. Then the construct moved. Not violently, not with the discharge that had burned the surveyors, with any sudden or threatening motion. The seams, all of them, every ring around its circumference simultaneously illuminated. Not with heat, with light, a pale, cool white that had no color bias to it, neither warm nor cold, just present, as if the light itself were a substance the construct was producing, rather than emitting. The markings between the seams resolved. They were not a language I recognized. They were not a language anyone in the chamber had any right to recognize, but they moved, slowly, in sequence, ring by ring from the base to the crown, and the movement had the quality of speech, of something being said. Orvid made a sound behind me. I did not turn around. The surface of the construct changed. The seams widened, not opening, not yet but flexing, the material around them, shifting with a precision that spoke of engineering so fine it made every fabricated object I had ever catalogued feel rough, proximate. The light between the seams strengthened. The markings cycled faster, and then the sound. It was not a voice in any register I could have predicted. It was low, lower than a human voice can easily produce, and it carried harmonics above and below the fundamental tone simultaneously, so that you heard it not only with your ears but with your chest, with the bones of your face, with some part of your nervous system that does not normally participate in listening. It was the sound of something enormous waking. It spoke one line, 4 words. They landed in the chamber the way weight lands, not noise but presence. I felt them in the backs of my hands, and in the place behind my sternum, where grief lives when it has aged long enough to become something else. You were always the keeper. I stood still for a long time after that. The construct remained lit. The markings continued their slow cycling. The seams had widened to the point where I could see the interior. Not the mechanism, not the function, but the space within, which was not dark. It was full of that same sourceless pale light. And within it were forms I could not interpret. Structures that implied purpose without explaining it. Arrangements of geometry that felt like memory rather than machinery. Orvid was saying something. I could hear him, but I was not listening. I thought about 9 years of sweeping floors in an archive hall. I thought about 11 platforms and 30 years, and the way I had always gone to the thing that was being left alone. The artifact in the corner that the teams walked past, the sealed object in the shaft no one wanted to document, the relic that sat quiet in the dark waiting for someone to stop treating it like a problem. I had never understood why I worked that way. I had attributed it to stubbornness, to the particular contrariness of a person who grew up with nothing and learned that the overlooked thing is, sometimes, the real thing. Maybe it was that. But the construct had been sealed for a very long time, and it had waited. And it had not opened for ambassadors or engineers or cutting rigs or the accumulated will of 230 years of human ambition pointing itself at a door. It had opened for a woman who said she wasn't there to take anything. I reached out and placed my palm flat against its surface. The light in the seams brightened without changing character. Steady, sure, the way a lamp brightens when you turn up its wick, and it has been waiting for exactly that. I stood there in shaft 11 with my hand on the oldest thing I had ever touched, and I tried to hold the weight of what had just been said to me. I am still trying. Some things, it turns out, require more than one lifetime to carry, but they choose their carrier carefully. They always have.